So South Africans had far too much debt before the pandemic struck. So how have job losses and decreased income under lockdown exacerbated that situation?
Thank you for having me on the show. Firstly, I think what we see is that South Africans are being squeezed on both ends. We certainly saw real income levels go down by about 20% compared to a few years ago. And on top of that, for those who do have an income, on average, they're also taking home less. And as a result, I think what's happening is that consumers have to borrow more to make ends meet. And I think that's just become a lot worse over the last 12 months in terms of what we can tell.
How does growing unserviced debt affect our country's economic outlook on the whole?
Well, when we have a debt that is at high interest rates, such as the unsecured debt, we're talking about somewhere between 21 to 24% interest rate per annum. And if you think about that, what that means is if you're borrowing about 50,000 Rand, then over the course of paying back that loan, you're going to end up paying close to double of that amount. And what that means is it's going to take up a huge portion of your net income. So what that means in turn is essentially consumers, we're finding is they're having to pay about 60% of their net income or take home towards debt repayments, meaning they have very little left to cover their expenses, let alone putting money aside for savings and other investments. And I think this is going to play out on a large scale. It's really going to hurt us in the long term in terms of the ability to invest because we're spending so much money on terms of paying back the debt.
As you were saying in our introduction there, it is a vicious cycle, a spiral. People don't have money to pay their bills, so they borrow money. The loan might help them get through a few months, but then they're back to being in a pinch, and now they're also indebted. Is there an alternative to this debt trap?
Well, we think that consumers should think about their debt and debt repayments a little bit differently, and that's part of the reason why we also launched the National Debt Awareness Month this year. We want consumers to essentially get help and don't wait too long. We've certainly seen a lot of psychological effects on the population over the last 12 months, and I think debt is something that also eats away at people. And normally consumers think of debt and debt repayments as something that is untouchable. You know, they have this amount that they have to pay every month. And I think with something like debt counseling, which is not necessarily a solution for everyone, but many consumers would be able to benefit from it, with significant reductions in interest rates, we believe that consumers should explore the opportunity whether their debt repayments can be lowered on a monthly basis and allowing them the breathing room that they really need.
Responsible lending means banks and financial institutions have to do affordability checks to make sure that lenders can repay loans. But we all know that that's not always the case, and it's essentially quite easy to get a loan. Are there enough measures in place to discourage people from taking out debt that they would struggle to repay and which will more than likely worsen their financial situation in the long run?
I think the lending landscape has changed dramatically over the last 5 years since the strengthening of the National Credit Act in 2015. And I do believe there are quite good measures in place. But as we always say, it takes two to tango. At Debt Busters, that's a saying that we have. Consumers have to be absolutely truthful when they apply for the loans and declare their expenses as the truth and not under-declare their expenses. And at the same time, lenders have to be very diligent in terms of financial assessments that they make. So we think there's definitely room to improve on both fronts, but we have definitely seen the situation improve. I think, unfortunately, what we see today in terms of debt counseling applications is generally what we call the legacy loans that have been taken several years back, and now it's become difficult for consumers to pay back.
As part of debt counseling, you teach people basic financial skills. What's the first thing we need to know about gradually improving our financial position and reducing debt over time?
Andy, the first thing to do is write down your expenses on a monthly basis and make a budget for yourself. Write down every single thing that you're spending and you and your family are spending together, and write down every single amount of money that's coming in as income and compare the two. That's the very first and basic step, and I think it's an extremely empowering step for every consumer to do that. And these days, there are fantastic self-help and self-assessment tools. Even on our website, consumers can go and essentially do some self-assessments and budgeting. And I always say that is always the place to start from. Write down your expenses and get a true picture of what you're really spending money on.
Benay, it's a very difficult thing to do when you know that your financial outlook is nothing but debilitating and depressing. So many South Africans have a head-in-the-sand approach where if you don't look at the numbers numbers, you can continue to fool yourself that you won't be in big trouble at the end of each month. But facing up to that reality, as you say, is the starting point. Many families, however, live very much below their means. How do we get out of that?
I think our starting point is essentially, like we say, understand your financial situation. As we sit here today, less than 10% of South Africans have ever seen their credit report, and even less have even ever budgeted for themselves. I think the difficulty is true, as you say. It's extremely difficult, and with the pandemic, many of the support networks that we would traditionally rely on, such as our family and friends, are also in a difficult position. But, it doesn't help to delay the process. So what we're telling consumers as part of the National Debt Awareness Month is start today. Start with something small. Start with writing down your expenses. Start with getting a free copy of your credit report, which you're entitled to on an annual basis. And I think once we get, as consumers, better exposure to both our debt situation and our credit report, we will feel much more empowered and take the necessary steps.
Thank you very much for speaking to us. DebtBusters COO Benay Sager speaking to us there about increasing debt levels.